Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our November 2021 episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. Tonight we're going to cross the border to Massachusetts for a conversation with Dr. David Landon, Associate Director of the Andrew Fiske Memorial Center for Archaeological Research at UMASS Boston. We're going to talk about the archaeological investigations he, his students, and colleagues have been working on for the last several years in collaboration with Plymouth Patuxet Museums and the town of Plymouth. Their documentary environmental and archaeological research led them to identify and investigate a portion of the earliest English pilgrim settlement in Plymouth, as well as evidence of pre-colonial and contact period Wampanoag and later period historic sites. So, David, it's great to have you on the line this evening. We're really looking forward to talking about Plymouth.
Thank you.
Before we jump into the discussion, and I forgot to introduce Scott Brady as well. Sorry, Scott.
Well, he's here. Yeah.
My co-host, Scott Brady. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and the Fiske Center before we kind of get into the discussion of the archaeology?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Let me just start by saying that I'm thrilled to be talking to you tonight. This is, one of my favorite topics and very apropos for November to talk about the story of the Plymouth colony. I'm the Associate Director of the Andrew Fiske Memorial Center for Archaeological Research at UMass Boston and the Program Director for the Master's Program in Historical Archaeology. So we have a research center at UMass Boston that's really focused on kind of recent colonial sites in the Americas and in the Atlantic world more broadly, and we train a lot of students in that area, and so this kind of a project is very much in our wheelhouse, I guess you would say.
Great. So we're really interested in talking about Plymouth tonight because we've been learning a lot about the early colonial period here in the region over the last several years. There's been a lot of important discoveries and investigations of sites like the Waterman site in Massachusetts and the Webdene-Stevens and Hollister sites in Connecticut. And, for us at least, your research has really important implications for better understanding those sites, but it's also just generally interesting, I think, to everybody because it's such a critical and iconic part of the kind of American origin story.
Yeah, it is, and quite honestly, we engaged in this project very, very much for that reason. So, we started working on this in 2012, thinking very forward to 2020, which was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower. As we all know, 2020 didn't turn out quite as we expected.
That's for sure.
But our archaeology project was very much framed kind of in the lead up to that, giving us an opportunity to kind of rethink what we understood about the 17th century and about the Plymouth colony, and quite honestly, to rethink what we kind of know as our kind of mythologized story of that history.
So the project is done in collaboration with Plymouth Patuxet Museums and the town of Plymouth. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship and how you all got together on this project?
Yeah, the collaborative aspects of this are really interesting, and it goes really even beyond those two organizations. What I frequently tell people is I don't think I've ever worked on archaeology in an area where so many people were really deeply committed and invested to the history that we were studying. So, Plymouth Patuxet Museums, many of you are probably familiar with that museum. They have a kind of a reconstructed 17th century village that is supposed to represent kind of our best historical and archaeological understanding of what the original Plymouth colony settlement looked like. And they also have a Wampanoag home site there that's interpreted by Indigenous interpreters to give their kind of first-person perspective on Native history in the region. So they're a really interesting collaborator because because they really want to know every bit of detail that we can get out of this project. And because they try and operationalize it, they try and actually kind of recreate it. The town of Plymouth has been really a big supporter because they've been really generous with our ability to work on town property. So as kind of the primary kind of public entity where we're working, they're a major kind of stakeholder, and honestly, part of our tie with the town right from the beginning was thinking about what 2020 might be like, and kind of their heritage tourism implications of it for the town. Again, something that didn't quite pan out the way we were expecting to, but an interesting part of our collaboration nonetheless. And then we finally, there are a lot of descendant communities who really kind of tie themselves really directly to this history. The Mashpee Wampanoag, many members of that community really feel a very direct connection to their ancestors who are part of this history, and there's lots of descendant communities of the Pilgrims and the people who came on the Mayflower and later colonists who came in. A lot of people who are really invested and tied to that history as well. So, a really interesting kind of collaborative, very broad collaborative structure to the project.
Yeah. Have you had the opportunity to integrate descendants into any of the research, the descendant communities?
Yeah, and that's really an interesting part of it. So we've been working closely with the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and for multiple years when we were out digging, we had members of the tribe coming and joining our project in the summer during our excavation. This had a lot of benefits to it. We got to hear some versions of this history from the tribal perspective very directly. And also, since we were running this as an archaeological field school from UMASS Boston, in very practical terms, the state of Massachusetts to kind of essentially certify people as technicians for archaeological field projects that the state oversees, they like people to have formal training through an archaeological field school. So members of the tribe who came and worked with us kind of got to go through this formal field school training, which kind of gave them the skills to work as field technicians on projects that the state was permitting. So that's been a really interesting part of the partnership. And we've also worked some on properties that other descendant organizations maintained or still looked after. So the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, we did some test excavations on their property in Plymouth, and this last summer we were back to a parcel of land that the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum owns on Coles Hill, where we got to do some additional excavations this summer. So interesting opportunities to work with the descendant communities.
Hey, Dave, Scott Brady here. I was just wondering if, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, and if you can't think of anything, that's fine, but you were talking about some of the different perspective the Wampanoag descendants brought to the story. Is there anything that struck you or stood out as that you weren't aware of or you heard from a different perspective from the Native community?
Oh, yeah. It's I'll tell you a story, and it's kind of an intense one, but it really speaks very directly to this question. So as we were initiating this project, we were fundraising and writing grants to try and get some support, and one of our grant applications was to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and part of their process was to try and actually kind of reach out in a very explicit way to descendants and stakeholders and give them an opportunity to comment on our project. And our real ultimate goal was to try and find part of the original kind of settlement and fort right in the downtown of Plymouth. And one of the people they reached out to at the time was Ramona Peters, who was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Mashpee at the time. And the program officer said to her, do you feel like you have any concerns or want to comment about this project? And she said to him, is this the project that's looking for the Pilgrim Fort in downtown Plymouth? And he said, yes, it is. And she said, well, one of my ancestors was decapitated and had his head put on a spike next to that fort. So yes, I do think I actually have something to say about this project. Now, that's a really intense story.
Yeah.
I'll say.
And a really kind of hard perspective on some of this history to hear, because we don't have any stories about that kind of treatment of Native people as part of our kind of mythologized understanding of the Plymouth colony.
Right.
And yet, when you actually kind of go back and look closely at the historical record, and the reality of it is that was part of this is part of this history too. I have to say one really interesting thing about the town of Plymouth as a collaborator. One of the things I really appreciate about the town is that the town is actually willing to be really open about memorializing very different views of this history. So there's actually a memorial plaque in the town that tells the story that I just told you, as part of the way that the town has opened up the kind of ability of people to put different perspectives on this story. So I do find that to be, it's on their audio tour. It's a hard part of the history to hear, and not something we usually are kind of confronted with. But it's interesting that the town is willing to memorialize that story as well.
I think as across the country, we're trying to come to grips with, how much of this story should be told. I think that's really important. I think that's very forward thinking on the part of the town. I think that's great.
Yeah, and it's striking to hear that story very directly from a descendant. And quite honestly, as the director of this project, it's kind of like, well, how do I respond to that? And it's like, It's like, well, so I spoke to her and I said, archaeologists usually don't find things that kind of represent such a very specific moment in time as you're talking about. But what would you want us to do? How do you want us to handle, kind of that perspective on this history? And she's like, well, if you find remains of my ancestors, it's important to me about what the archaeology tells you. Is this person actually buried, or is this remains that are thrown out in the trash? And if these are remains that are thrown out in the trash, we want them back. And if these are remains that are buried, we don't want you to disturb them. And I was like, wow, I'm actually talking to somebody who really understands archaeology, like a lot.
Yeah.
That's a very sophisticated distinction about like archaeological context on sites. And I was like, okay, I got it. Like we're on it. We're on the case. We're with you on that one. So yeah, it's not what archaeologists always encounter, and it's been an important part of our project.
Thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it really, it kind of speaks to the importance of collaboration and, really just talking to Indigenous people as we do archaeology, which is something I think that as a discipline, as a field, we're getting a lot better at, but there's still a long way to go. And I, lots of times with cultural resource management projects and things and grants that are federally funded, there's that kind of requirement to do so. But that's an important first step, I think, to nudge people towards maybe better relationship building. And so it sounds like this has been a great opportunity for that.
Yeah, this has been a good opportunity for that. These things are never perfect. It's always a work in progress, but I think that this is what we have to try and aspire to as much as we can. So, yeah, it's important.
Yeah, I don't want to get too off topic in terms of the archaeology, but it did raise another question for me, and I was thinking about Native descendants as well as the descendants of the English colonists. Has there been any interaction as a result of this project between those two groups of people? Have they come together, had discussions, been in the same place?
I wouldn't say that happened so much around the archaeology, but that actually did happen some around kind of broader questions and discussions around how this kind of 400th anniversary was going to be marked in a certain way. So yes, that does take us a little bit off the archaeology, but there were, I think, some parts of the way that was kind of negotiated in terms of there are people who very much view kind of the Plymouth colony as kind of the toehold of a genocide that's coming for Native people, and that's one kind of edge of the views on this, but I think a lot of people, Native people included, can see nuance in this story and find ways. I think around other aspects of the way that kind of the language and discussion and activities around the 400th were envisioned. That definitely there was some communication that was good and productive.
Great, thank you. Well, why don't we shift gears a little bit and start talking about the nuts and bolts of the archaeology? So,
sure.
Scott and I have both been out to the site at different times, so we kind of have a physical sense of where you've all been working. But can you tell us a little bit about, the archaeological project, working in the middle of a town, basically, you said in downtown Plymouth, how that...
Yeah. That's been a real eye-opener to me, I have to say, in lots of different ways. We're working very much in the downtown of Plymouth, and we've been digging all over the downtown. We started this in 2012, so and had our first kind of digging season in 2013. We missed 2020, but we were out again in the summer of 2021. So we were out this last summer. So that's a lot of time digging, in the town of Plymouth, and we've explored a lot of different areas, and it's just been a really, really interesting learning process through that. Part of it is that for people who've been there, and it is a real tourist destination, which is fun in its own right. For people who've been there, it really presents as very much kind of this small New England town, very kind of bucolic, lots of kind of public park areas and so on. And our digging really has kind of shown that to be a real construction in a sense. The digging does not look like a small town. The digging we've been doing really, we've been digging on town land, so we've been in a lot of these parks, these town parks. But a lot of the town parks are actually kind of not like a natural park in the sense that it's always been like that, but parks that were kind of created at certain points in the history. And it's been really fascinating because a major point in the history when kind of the town was kind of cleaned up and parks were created was in the lead up to the 300th anniversary in 1920. So in the 19-teens, there's actually this major restructuring of the landscape in Plymouth that creates what today seem like these timeless parks, but actually these were areas that were very built up, that were cleaned up, the buildings were removed to kind of create a certain landscape around the 300th. And it's a fascinating topic. As an archaeologist, I'm like, wow, this is, the landscape really gets restructured at this time. Like, that's an interesting question, interesting historical and archaeological question, trying to understand the dynamics of that. But it's very dramatic. Then, since it's a tourist town, there's tourists all the time. So that really sets a tone for the archaeology. The archaeology as like a tourist attraction in the town, that's kind of been new to me. And then our main kind of excavation site where we kind of have really had the most dramatic results is this incredible historic cemetery right in the center of the downtown, Burial Hill Cemetery. It's an amazing historic landscape in its own right, with grave markers going back to the 1680s, grave markers from the 1680s to the 1950s, spanning the centuries, all kinds of monuments and memorials added to the hill in addition to the grave markers. And we've been working a lot around the boundaries of the cemetery as part of our excavation. So that's also been a really kind of interesting process. When we first started, the very first season that we worked on the edge of Burial Hill, it's a beloved cemetery in the town. Lots of people who take a strong sense of stewardship over this place. The first summer that we worked there, I had tried my best to make sure everybody in Plymouth knew what we were going to be doing. Yet the first time we go out to Burial Hill, the edge of the cemetery with a shovel, the phone's ringing at the police department because it's like there's people with shovels at the burial, So it's like, and it's like, wow, I really tried to tell everyone what we were about to do. We had like a public meeting at the library and everything, but it's been an interesting. It was a process getting everyone in the town comfortable with what we were doing at this very kind of beloved historic site in the center of the town.
Having been there and seen, it really is more of an urban environment almost than a
Yes.
rural.
Yes.
I'm shocked that, and maybe I shouldn't be, because over the last couple of years we here in Connecticut have found some sites that really shouldn't be there, at least by, conventional wisdom. Were you surprised that you could go back that far and find those original kind of earliest settler kind of components?
We started working on this, as I said, almost a decade ago now, and we didn't find those right away, and people in the town started, one of our big supporters, at the Pilgrim Hall Museum started saying like, well, how many years are you going to keep looking and before you kind of give up? And what I always told people is like, look, they found a shipwreck underneath Ground Zero at the World Trade Center, like arguably the most urbanized place in the entire country. And yet when they actually went to go, rebuild, they found a shipwreck that was in the fill underneath the World Trade Center. So anything's possible, however urbanized the area is, if you accept that, So we persevered and we did ultimately, find some parts of the 17th century settlement, preserved intact in the downtown. But it definitely is a challenge. And what I like, it's kind of one of the ways I describe that is we're never going to get the whole layout of the town or really be able to trace out the whole settlement because the town's built up on top of it. But essentially, what we've got is one jigsaw piece, one jigsaw puzzle piece of the puzzle. That's the town. We found little patches of area that are intact in this very urbanized environment. And this last summer, we were digging on the Pilgrim Hall lot on Coles Hill. Again, very kind of changed landscape, a landscape that was really created in the lead up to the 300th. We were working on a lot that houses were taken by eminent domain in the 19-teens to kind of get rid of the houses and make more of kind of what's now there as Coles Hill Park, the hill overlooking the monument. And we found an intact section, a small intact section of an ancient Wampanoag site right there preserved on that lot, and it was only in a small area, but it's just it's really been an interesting process of like the urban area means that lot is not preserved, but we've systematically been searching to try and find those areas where small, one piece of the puzzle is kind of preserved in the downtown.
Yeah. So I know a lot of the work that you've been doing and a lot of what you found is actually on Burial Hill in the cemetery. So we do a lot of work through the Office of State Archaeology with cemeteries, helping cemeteries for planning purposes figure out where unmarked graves are, trying to locate the graves of paupers and people of color that have not been marked and not been memorialized over time. So we always run into a lot of unmarked burials in historic cemeteries. So how did you kind of navigate that when you were trying to excavate in those areas that were the cemetery?
Yeah, and that one has been a little bit of a challenge, and I guess we did a lot of geophysical survey work, so we did a lot of ground penetrating radar work in advance of our digging, and in practical terms, what we really tried to do was find the margins of the burial ground. So we tried to find like the edge of where the graves were, and then just kind of step outside of where the graves were located, to kind of find the margins of the cemetery and work outside the margins of the cemetery. And it's interesting because our the main area where we've been digging, there were a series of late 18th and 19th century buildings along the edge of what's now the cemetery. And those buildings, from our digging, we've really found out kind of destroyed anything that was there previously. But immediately behind those buildings, there's a little gap kind of between the back of those 18th and 19th century buildings that are no longer standing, those buildings that are gone, but a gap between the back of those buildings and where the graves start on the burial hill. And we've been doing a lot of digging in that gap, essentially. We've kind of identified that margin gap and had that be the focus of our work. And people have always asked me, hey, do you want to go digging like in the center of the graveyard? I was like, there's lots of unmarked burials there. We know that from our work. And really the only way I thought that it would be possible for us to do that is if we found some kind of feature that we could follow into the cemetery a little, to try and kind of map part of the settlement. So far we have not done that. We've really avoided digging in what you would think of as the cemetery proper.
While we're talking about the cemetery, having been there and stood on top of that hill, I mean, to me, that's the prime piece of real estate in town. How did that become Burial Hill? How did that become this kind of a sprawling cemetery?
Yeah, so we're jumping over. I guess I jumped over like the earlier history of that. You're right. Thank you for that question. Before it was Burial Hill, from kind of the period of the initial settlement up until the 1670s, it was actually known as Fort Hill, and it was the since it was kind of the high point in the landscape in Plymouth, the peak of the hill was kind of used as the original location for the kind of fort and meeting house for the colony, and the colony then kind of stretched out with its houses running down the hill towards the water of what's now kind of Coles Hill, and the entire area was encircled with a kind of a palisade wall, a wooden stockade fence that was built around it, and everyone lived inside of that for the first 7 years of the colony, from 1620 to 1627, and so the kind of ultimate fate of that colony, as people started moving out, Plymouth became less important as a town as the colonists started establishing all the towns around the Cape and other parts of Plymouth Bay and Marshfield and situated out on Cape Cod. But they kind of maintained the notion of this kind of fort and central government area, and ultimately did not really kind of permanently disband this and take it apart as a fort until after what's called King Philip's War in the 1670s, which is essentially kind of the last kind of organized native attempt to drive the English out, which, kind of in the aftermath of that, they felt it was no longer necessary to have the hill be fortified and took it down. And by local lore, some of the wood is actually incorporated into a house that's still standing in Plymouth. So,
great.
So an interesting kind of history of the end of that.
So how did can you tell us a little bit about the kind of the discovery of the Pilgrim settlement, the earliest parts of it, how you found it, when you knew you were there, when you knew you actually had it?
Yeah. So as I said, that took us a few years and lots of digging and lots of kind of learning about what it looks like in this environment, and ultimately then one of the things that we learned that's really interesting that I think is kind of a broader lesson that people are learning about the archaeology of this time period in New England, is that the colonists did not have a lot of stuff. And so when you're looking for their sites, there's not a lot of artifacts scattered around from 1650 in Plymouth because they just didn't have a lot of stuff. So really what we have found is that we don't find artifacts from that time period until we're right on top of part of a feature or a site from that time period. So there's no kind of scatter of 17th century artifacts across the town of Plymouth. And it's an interesting contrast to the Wampanoag artifacts, because everywhere you dig in Plymouth, there's Wampanoag artifacts. It doesn't matter if it's like industrial fill, an old building foundation, anywhere you dig, no matter what the time period, there's always Wampanoag artifacts present there. A real testimony to the thousands of years of Wampanoag occupation. But the 17th century stuff is really missing. So it took us a few years, but we started kind of finding small numbers of 17th century artifacts, and we're like, okay, we're getting closer. And ultimately, we started finding some of those kind of in intact soil layers and features that were like, okay, we're finding the first features that are related to the colony after multiple years of survey and digging, and it was exciting, and it was nice because archaeology is a lot about we want to learn things about the past. In the public view, it's very much kind of about discovery, and for archaeologists, sometimes it actually is about discovery, and it's exciting when it's about discovery, and it's like, okay, we actually discovered something. We actually found in the downtown, part of the original settlement, preserved in the downtown. We found some of those deposits. We identified the palisade line, so we found the kind of soil stain left by part of this fence line that encircled the colony. We found parts of buildings there. We found a dead calf that they buried out in a pit in the yard. We found a lot of stuff that was actually related to it, and ultimately, there is something that's kind of exciting about that, putting that on the map in a real way.
Yeah, I imagine. At some level, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, started.
Yes.
Now, and obviously I know this is an ongoing project, and the amount of time it takes to get artifacts in the lab and determine what they are and draw some conclusions. But, you said it at the beginning, we have this mythology of what the Pilgrims wore and how they acted and what they did when they got here. Has anything in the archaeology kind of either supported that, or are there parts of it that you're going, well, that's not quite looking at what we're seeing in the ground?
So that's been a really interesting part of that. Yeah, thanks for that prompt on that question. That's been a really interesting part of our project. And something we actually talked a lot about, like at the beginning, like, wow, this is history that's really well known. How do we kind of add anything to this? Does the archaeology have something to really contribute in a certain sense? And we kind of tried to approach that in part by like looking and thinking critically about what the archaeology of the Plymouth colony was. What's known about the archaeology of the Plymouth colony, and what's the perspective on that. And when you look at that, and that's really well known because that's Jim Dietz's work when he was at Brown, and he was working at Plymouth Plantation, which is the previous name for Plymouth Patuxet Museum. And he was digging a lot of these 17th century sites and interpreting them, and writing in Small Things Forgotten, which is kind of a classic of kind of New England archaeology of the period, and his follow-on work on that. And so when you look at that, it's kind of like, okay, what was there anything that he was missing that's like useful for us to add to this, or are we just kind of redoing this in a way? And it's a kind of a testament to the way our thinking has changed also as archaeologists, and we kind of tried to invert, I guess you would say, some of the traditional thinking about the archaeology and the history a little bit, to see if we could kind of flip the question and come to any new conclusions if we actually literally 180 the question. So one of the early historical and archaeological questions that people asked about this was like, how much is this like an English transplant into the new colony? And people really went a long way to try and answer that question, like which kind of English traditions came to New England? Which kind of parts of the house building can we directly trace back to English antecedents? Can we find the form of the building that got transplanted, the customs, the folkways that got transplanted? And we've tried to kind of flip that question. Okay, so people have actually found out which parts of this are English transplants. The reverse of that question are not English transplants. What happened in this environment that's new? You're encountering all these new people. It's a new environment. Can we actually find anything that changes or that's different that makes us rethink our understanding of that? And a similar part of the kind of archaeological understanding of this region is, and this comes from looking at collections, and the kind of issues and problems that are kind of arise from all these collections we're generating as archaeologists, and what do we do with them, and saving these collections, and collections that were dug up a long time ago, these legacy collections, and the value of them, thinking about that, the complexities of that, the cost of that, and the need for storage space. This is very much something at Plymouth Patuxet Museum. They have all these collections. How do we justify keeping these? Well, when you go back and look at these collections, at all the sites they were digging where they were looking for English transplants, they're also finding native artifacts. They're finding, Wampanoag pottery, and they're finding stone tools and, stone chipping debris, and it kind of begs the question, well, why is all this stuff here? If you're, as an archaeologist, if you're digging this up, what does this mean? And traditionally, in Dietz's work, the kind of regional understanding was, the English liked the same environmental locations as the Wampanoag, so any place there was an English site, they're just settling on top of a place where the Wampanoag had lived previously, and so there's all this Wampanoag artifacts because of the fact that, it's just they're settling on the same sites. Well, as soon as you make that interpretation, you're essentially kind of removing from the consideration like Wampanoag people in the historic landscape. You're kind of distancing them from a site that was previous to the English site, that these artifacts are not related. And ultimately, that is a technical archaeology question. Like, when we're digging, are the Wampanoag artifacts and the English artifacts related to the same site, or are these two sites on top of each other? That's actually like a very kind of technical archaeology digging question that we really tried to address. And so I think in the most kind of fundamental, if we're thinking about like what kind of perspectives we've added, we've really been pushing to kind of rethink the relationship between the English colonists and native people and how we see that and think about it archaeologically. I think that's been kind of one of our biggest pushes.
Yeah, is that something you've been able to tease out from the archaeology so far? I mean, I know that at a lot of sites, I'm thinking about the Hollister site where Scott and I have been working, which is 17th century farm complex, and looking back to Sylvester Manor, places like that, the Waterman site in Marshfield, and all of those sites, there clearly seem to be the integration of native-made things, particularly pottery, right, into the cultural inventories of the settlers that were there. Have you found clear evidence of that at Plymouth as well, of the use of native pots and other native materials?
Yes, we have, and it's really interesting because it when you talk about like native pots in English houses in New England, that runs very counter to a lot of traditional thinking in New England. But it's really funny because when you float that with people who are working on colonial settlements in other areas, even in the United States, they think that's ridiculous that we wouldn't just assume that there would be native pottery in colonist houses. Like, one of my colleagues works in the Southwest on Spanish sites in the Southwest. It's almost all native pottery there. Of course the Spanish had native pottery. Why wouldn't they have native pottery in the house? And it's kind of interesting because it's like, wow, that's not like our starting assumption kind of in southern New England. Like, of course the colonists would have native pottery in their houses. It's not our starting assumption, and it's kind of an interesting the way the kind of historical, thinking about archaeology has influenced the way we interpret things. And since we were, really trying to address that question, we're like, is there evidence that like this native pottery and this English pottery kind of really seem to go together? And in parts of our site, it's clear that like, yeah, wow, we really do have some evidence that suggests that kind of native pottery and European pottery was being used side by side, at least in some of these houses. The fun part of collaborating with Plymouth Patuxet Museum is then they're like, wow, okay, native pot in an English house. They will do that in the Living History Museum and bring a native pot into the English house. And so, that's a very concrete example of kind of the way that we've tried to use the archaeology to speak to that question that you're asking. Yeah.
What have you learned so far about the built environment? You mentioned that you found part of the palisade wall, and talked a little bit about the kind of idea that we should be looking for these traditional English house, or that people used to think we should be looking for these traditional English house forms in the archaeological record. But you found a few features related to domestic architecture, the palisade, things like that. What can you tell us about those with the built environment of the early Plymouth colony?
I wish I could tell you more than I can. I wish we had learned a little bit more than we have. And this is the challenge of kind of working in the downtown. As I said, it's a jigsaw puzzle piece, and we're never going to get a very big picture of these buildings or of the built environment. and that's compounded by the fact that these early structures are very ephemeral and don't leave a really obvious kind of footprint. So the palisade, which is arguably kind of like a really exciting discovery, it was wooden posts put in the ground in post holes. When something like that, is gone, it's kind of dark soil stains in the ground that's left behind. It's like, come on, everyone, look at the exciting architect. We found the palisade. You see that kind of dark brownish stain on the ground there? Like, we think that's the palisade line there, so it doesn't kind of present visually as a very exciting aspect of the archaeology. And for the archaeologists, that's a challenge too, because we spend a lot of time head scratching over is this dirt like darker and siltier than the dirt next to it, and how much darker do you think it is? I think it's a little bit darker for sure, and so it becomes a real kind of puzzle to tease out the built environment, and honestly, Wampanoag buildings from the same time period are similar. It's built with posts. Yeah, it's wooden posts put in the ground. What's left then is the stains from where these posts rotted out, and so trying to reconstruct the buildings becomes difficult. Now one of the buildings we found, we've got better evidence for. We found parts of two buildings, plus part of the palisade. One of the buildings we got better evidence for because it was an unusual building. It was cut into the hillside, and seems to have used the cut into the hillside as two of the walls. So you could kind of think of it as a partially dug out building, where they kind of dug the building into the hillside, held back the sand of the hillside with wooden planking. It appears they kind of put some wooden planks up to kind of make a back and side wall of the building, and then built more traditional walls in the areas that weren't into the hillside. And then this was had a daubed interior to the building, so they took kind of a grayish clay and kind of used that clay to plaster the interior of the building wall. And when that building was ultimately abandoned and came down, that gray daub kind of collapsed and washed in and covered the floor of the building. So we were able to recover part of the floor of one of these buildings by recognizing and finding it under this daub wall fall, where the daub wall had come down on the building floor. And that building, no sign of an actual, no stone foundation, no brick foundation, right? It's wooden posts in the ground and cut into the embankment, where part of the embankment is making two walls of the building, presumably just a hole in the ceiling for the smoke to go out, a fire on the floor. We did find this last summer the location of, kind of where the fire was on the floor. It did have at least one, nice diamond pane window. So the little hobbit house in the side, cut into the bank, had at least one glass window in it. The folks at Plymouth Patuxet Museum were really excited about that, because it's like, we could put a glass window on one of our buildings in our, we can't say specifically that glass window dates to before 1627, but it does date to the first half of the 17th century probably, and gives you an idea of wow, this is this is not like a standard English building. This is something that's being constructed kind of in a colonial context where we're trying to get a building built quickly. We shortcut it by not building two of the walls and just digging into the embankment. But ultimately, then at some point, even put a glass window onto the building to make it a little nicer, or add some light inside. So, in kind of an interesting amalgam that it does, in fact, kind of speak to this kind of colonial setting and colonial environment.
So, I have to ask because we're talking about the pilgrims and Thanksgiving is coming, but what have you learned about foodways? Because in my mind, when I think about the pilgrims, and it's probably colored by the iconic Thanksgiving story, but I have this idea of these just like weary, hungry people who desperately needed help, from local indigenous people who knew the land and climate to help put food on their tables. And what have you learned about food and diet in the colony? Is there good evidence preserved at the site? Do you have evidence of, that integration of North American native food sources that are being integrated into the English diet?
This is one that's actually been more frustrating than satisfying in our ability to answer this question, because it depends really on very much on kind of the preservation of certain kinds of archaeological materials on sites, and different material. It doesn't all preserve the same, and to get kind of good evidence for like the corn, you have to have the preserved corn cobs or burned corn kernels or something that gets preserved. We certainly have been looking for that evidence, but it's been difficult to find. So we haven't, I don't think, gotten as good a resolution on that question, especially about the plants. Mm-hmm. And with the animals, the bones, the bones preserve better than the plant remains do. So we've got a little bit better evidence, but it's very, very slim relative to what we would want. And the kind of animal bone evidence, there's kind of two features that we found that kind of speak most directly to that. Those are pretty interesting. One was, in part of the area we were digging, we really seemed to be out in the yard, in yard features where we were kind of like outside of the house, where the trash pits were, and where people had presumably kind of little kitchen gardens or were planting stuff, and there was what we interpret as a pathway and kind of so inside the settlement, but not inside of a house. Mm-hmm. And there we actually got kind of two interesting features that had bones preserved in them that speak to this a little bit. One was kind of a really dark and organic feature that when we were digging, we were like, wow, that looks extra dark and filthy in our classification scheme. So that one looks interesting, and as we start digging, it's like, wow, it looks like there's little bones preserved in this, and what could this be? And so we deployed our kind of archaeologist toolkit of special sampling, and took a lot of that small feature for flotation, and also took a section out of it as a block to kind of preserve a piece of it. Because as we were digging, I was like, these look like little fish bones, and I was like, this is organic, super organic, and very rich. It's like, is this a planting hole of some kind? And then I was like, do we have a planting hole with fish bones in it? And I was like, if I'm going to tell anyone we found a planting hole with fish bones in it, I'm going to have to prove that somehow. Like, I'm going to have to. So, let's take a block of this and put it in resin and preserve it for forever, so that I can actually say that we found this concentration of fish bones in a planting hole, and in fact that's really what it looks like we've got. And one of our students took a deep dive on identifying these little fish bones, and we've got herring head bones, not the rest of the herring, but herring head bones.
Oh, cool.
in a small, organically rich feature in the yard.
Dave, I hate to interrupt you, but we are going right up to our full hour. So can you tell people how to get in touch with you?
Learn more about the project?
To learn more about the project, actually the best place to head to learn more about the project is our website at the Fiske Center at UMass Boston, and you can find that. It's Fiske, the Fiske Center. We have a blog for the Fiske Center, which has lots of past information about our excavation, and we update it with exciting new lab finds as we go.
Great, thank you so much. This was great. We went through the time so fast.
Yeah. So herring for Thanksgiving dinner instead of turkey.
Well, there you go. There you go.
Thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
I think, yep. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.